That morning, I stared at my tablet screen. The account balance, the $485,000 life insurance payout from my late husband Thomas, meant for an orphanage, read exactly $0. Before I could breathe, my phone vibrated. It was my only son, Julian. "Mom," he said, his voice dripping with unearned confidence. "My wedding in the Hamptons is tomorrow. Chloe's brand needs this weekend to be flawless. I used my power of attorney to drain your account and just finalized the cash sale of the Greenwich estate. The movers are already in the driveway. Good luck." The line clicked dead, leaving a mocking dial tone echoing through my empty kitchen. If you are listening to this, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Let me tell you exactly how this high society nightmare started. I am Eleanor Caldwell. I am 68 years old. For 32 years, I served as the Chief of Private Banking and Trust Risk Management for a ruthless financial institution in Manhattan. I spent my career tracking white-collar fraud and dismantling corporate thieves. I know exactly how criminals think. I know their unyielding arrogance and their blind spots, and the absolute first rule of catching a thief is to let them think they have already won. So, I did not gasp, I did not scream. But inside my chest, the forensic investigator woke up, and her blood was absolute ice. A sudden, violent thud shattered the silence. The heavy double doors of my colonial estate were thrown wide open. I walked into the grand foyer and froze. Two burly movers were aggressively dragging a 19th century silver-gilt jewelry casket out the door. Family heirlooms passed down through 4 generations of Caldwell women. Right behind them, another worker carelessly tossed my original white silk satin wedding gown into a cardboard box like it was worthless trash. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying the razor-sharp authority I used to reserve for embezzling hedge fund executives. "What exactly do you think you are doing with my property?" The lead mover wiped sweat from his forehead with a look of pure annoyance. "Just doing our job, ma'am. The new owner's representative ordered an expedited clearance. House is sold." I marched toward the front door and tried to slide my key into the heavy brass deadbolt. It wouldn't even fit. The cylinder had been drilled out and replaced with a cheap, shiny new lock while I was sitting inside my own kitchen. "Show me the work order, right now," I commanded. The younger worker handed me a crumpled clipboard. There it was, in ruthless black and white, an emergency estate liquidation. And at the bottom, on the authorization line, was the loopy, hurried handwriting of Julian Caldwell. My own flesh and blood. The boy whose staggering Ivy League debts I had quietly erased had authorized a crew of strangers to strip my life bare. They expected me to sob. They expected me to shriek, call the local police, and make a pathetic, chaotic scene. But panic is a luxury you cannot afford when you are being robbed. If I intervened right now, I would only catch Julian in a messy domestic dispute. His shallow fiancée, Chloe Vance, a wrong 2X social media influencer, would hire a flashy PR lawyer to claim a tragic misunderstanding, tying me up in civil court for years. No. Today, I would let them celebrate. "All right," I said smoothly, handing the clipboard back. "Just be careful with the silver casket." The movers exchanged a confused look, totally thrown off by my lack of resistance, and carried my memories out to the idling truck. I walked back into the living room. The house felt hollow, stripped, and cold. Julian had been Kankit for months, desperately trying to maintain a multi-million-dollar lifestyle to satisfy Chloe. I had flatly refused to fund their extravagant beachside wedding because I knew she was simply using him. Apparently, this was Julian's twisted version of taking initiative. He had decided to steal his dead father's legacy to pay for a party. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my encrypted phone, and prepared to dial my son's number. I needed a confession captured in real time. But just as my finger hovered over the screen, the side door of the parlor opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. It was Evelyn. Evelyn had been my closest friend for over 35 years. She had poured wine with me on this porch and held my hand at Thomas's funeral. She knew every single detail of my life. "Evelyn," I breathed, a sudden wave of relief washing over me. "Thank God you're here. Julian has done something unspeakable. He's drained the insurance account, and these men—" I stopped. Evelyn didn't rush to embrace me. Instead, she stood perfectly straight, her expression completely detached. She walked over to my desk and picked up a small leather-bound notary ledger that I kept locked in my drawer. "I know, Eleanor," Evelyn said, her voice flat and devoid of warmth. I stared at her, my heart rate finally spiking. "What do you mean you know?" "I'm the one who notarized the temporary power of attorney for him 2 days ago," she whispered, refusing to meet my eyes. "And I'm the one who verified to the county clerk that you were mentally unfit to manage the Greenwich estate." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. "You signed off on this? You told them I was incompetent? Evelyn, you know my mind is perfectly sharp." Chloe offered my daughter a senior executive vice president position at her father's media conglomerate in Manhattan, Evelyn said, her voice hardening as she justified her treason. "Julian is your son, Eleanor. He deserves his inheritance now. You're living in the past, clinging to Thomas's old charity funds. It's over. The paperwork is finalized." She walked past me without a single backward glance, carrying her notary seal, leaving 35 years of friendship in the dust. The room seemed to tilt. My closest ally had just handed my enemies the ultimate legal weapon. If a respected notary testified that I was slipping mentally, my fight to reclaim the funds would be an uphill battle against the federal bureaucracy. The trap was closing around me, and I was entirely alone in an empty house. But they fundamentally underestimated who they were dealing with. I gripped my phone with a steady, unshakable hand. I pressed the record button on my encrypted application and dialed Julian's number. The phone rang 3 times before clicking open. A blast of loud electronic music and the obnoxious laughter of a Hamptons day party immediately assaulted my ear. "Hello?" Julian's voice was slightly slurred, shouting over the bass. He sounded deeply annoyed. "What is it, Mom? I'm in the middle of a toast." "Julian," I said, my voice completely flat and ice cold. "There are movers in my home taking my things. My primary account has been entirely drained. Where are you?" There was a brief pause. I heard him turn away, speaking to someone nearby. "Hold my mimosa, babe." It was Chloe Vance. I could hear her shrill, condescending voice in the background. "Is that your mother again? Tell her she's ruining the aesthetic of the bridal suite." "Mom, listen to me carefully," Julian said, the slurring instantly replaced by a rehearsed, cold sneer. "My wedding is tomorrow. This is the most important weekend of my life. I withdrew the money and I sold the house. You need to accept reality." "You sold my estate?" I asked, making sure to enunciate every single syllable clearly for the recording. "And you stole nearly $500,000 of your father's life insurance money?" "It's not stealing, Mom." Julian sighed heavily. "Let's be honest. Ever since Dad passed, you haven't been right. Evelyn agrees with us. You're getting old, your mind is slipping, and you're becoming unstable. You don't need a massive house all to yourself, and you definitely don't need hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in a checking account doing nothing. Chloe and I are putting that money to actual use. We are building our brand, our future." "Our future?" I repeated, the sheer audacity of his words hanging heavily in the room. "You are stealing the foundation money for an orphanage to pay for a weekend party in the Hamptons?" "Oh, please," Julian scoffed, a harsh, cruel sound. "Dad is gone. A charity shelter isn't going to bring him back. Consider this an early inheritance, Mom. Go find a nice, quiet, assisted living facility. The proceeds from whatever junk the movers sell today should cover your first few months. Good luck." The line went dead. A sharp, mechanical dial tone echoed in my ear. "Good luck." Those were the final words from my only son. I slowly lowered the phone and looked down at the screen. The file was securely saved. 1 minute and 42 seconds of pure, unadulterated grand larceny, document forgery, and elder abuse, validated by the betrayal of my oldest friend. They thought they had stripped me of my home, my wealth, and my sanity. They thought they had left me broken, penniless, and helpless on the kitchen floor. But as I stared out the window at the moving truck pulling out of my driveway, a slow, terrifying smile crept onto my face. They had no idea that the house they just sold didn't belong to me, the account they just drained was a digital honeypot, and the trap they thought they had escaped was about to snap shut with the violent wrath of a federal execution. I walked out the front door, leaving the empty shell of my home behind, and stepped into the shadow of the old oak tree. I pulled up a secondary, highly encrypted application on my phone, one that didn't route through local servers. I pressed a single button, and the true game officially began. The crisp autumn air bit through the fabric of my sweater as the screen of my encrypted phone hummed to life, its cold blue glow reflecting in my eyes while my mind remained anchored in that sterile, mechanical stillness. I stood motionless beneath the sweeping canopy of the ancient oak tree, watching the fallen leaves drift lazily across the empty gravel driveway where the moving truck had just been. My breath formed faint, fleeting ghosts in the morning chill, a physical manifestation of the sudden vacuum my life had become. I didn't break down, nor did I let the tremor in my chest reach my hands. Instead, I allowed the familiar armor of my old corporate life, the hyper-logical, unyielding facade of a risk manager, to slide over my skin like a second coat of mail. Yet beneath that armor, the raw, echoing quiet of the morning forced me to look backward, into the heavy, painful tapestry of how a mother's devotion could be twisted into her own undoing. I remembered when Julian was just a boy of 7, his face pale and burning with a fever that wouldn't break, his tiny fingers locked so tightly around mine that my knuckles turned white. For 3 agonizing nights in a sterile Manhattan hospital wing, I had stayed awake, whispering into his hair that as long as I breathed, the world would never harm him. I remembered the fierce, protective pride that swelled in my chest years later when Thomas and I stood on the manicured lawns of Columbia University, watching Julian walk across the stage in his sky blue gown. His laughter had been so bright, so full of promise, a promise paved entirely by the endless sacrifices, the late-night audits, and the generational safety nets Thomas and I had spent 30 years fortifying. Every trust fund cleared, every Ivy League tuition payment seamlessly transferred was an act of quiet masonry meant to build an unassailable fortress around my only child. To watch that same boy turn around, look at my grieving heart after his father's passing, and see nothing but an aging target for exploitation was a profound, suffocating betrayal that no financial forensic spreadsheet could ever fully quantify. Eleanor, the sharp, clinical click of designer heels on the flagstone walkway, broke my thoughts. I didn't turn around immediately. I let the silence stretch, forcing the speaker to wait, as I slowly adjusted my posture, turning with a deliberate, unbothered grace. Evelyn stood near the porch steps, her tailored wool coat buttoned tightly against the breeze, a heavy cream-colored document folder tucked securely under her arm. The woman who had shared 35 years of my life, the neighbor who had brought over casseroles when Thomas died, the godmother who had held Julian at his baptism, looked at me with a chilling, artificial warmth that made my stomach turn. "You're still standing out here in the cold, Eleanor," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a patronizing melodic rhythm that felt like a slap. "You need to come inside, or rather, what's left of it. Standing under the trees won't alter the legal reality of what has happened today." "The legal reality, Evelyn?" I inquired, keeping my voice entirely flat, a dangerous calm that usually made corporate fraud suspects sweat. "Or the reality of the price tag Chloe Vance put on a 35-year friendship?" Evelyn's eyes narrowed to sharp slits, a flash of defensive malice breaking through her practiced composure before she quickly smoothed it over with a dramatic, heavy sigh. "See? This is exactly the kind of cognitive disorientation Julian and I were talking about. This immediate hostility, this paranoid defensiveness. Ever since Thomas's accident, and especially after that minor neurological event you had last quarter, your mind simply hasn't been processing structural changes correctly. You're projecting your internal confusion onto the people who are trying to protect you. Gaslighting is a highly ineffective tool when utilized against a woman who literally co-wrote the compliance manual on psychological manipulation in private banking, Evelyn," I stated, my spine remaining perfectly straight. "You falsified a notary ledger. You authenticated a temporary power of attorney that you knew had expired 8 months ago. That isn't protection. That is grand larceny and forgery." Evelyn let out a short, mocking scoff, stepping closer until the suffocating scent of her expensive lavender perfume clouded the crisp morning air. She tapped the heavy folder under her arm with her manicured fingernails, a rhythmic, taunting sound. "Let me educate you on legal dead ends, Eleanor. You think you're still the high-powered executive who can freeze an entire board of directors with a single look. But look around you. Your house is completely cleared out. Your accounts are showing a clean zero balance. Julian signed the expedited deed transfer over to Vanguard Crest LLC at exactly 8:14 this morning. And as a respected state-certified notary, my official sworn deposition stating that you demonstrated severe short-term memory failure and erratic behavior during our estate consultation is already sitting on the regional compliance supervisor's desk at Chase Bank. She opened the folder, pulling out a crisp, watermarked document bearing the distinctive blue ink of an emergency judicial signature. Julian didn't just liquidate the property to secure his wedding funds, Eleanor, she continued, her lips curling into a triumphant, venomous smile. He filed an emergency ex parte petition for temporary adult guardianship. Because you became combative regarding his marital assets and threatened to withhold the insurance money, the court has granted him total custody of your physical person and your healthcare directives. Until the formal hearing in Manhattan next month, you are legally restricted from hiring independent counsel, entering any financial branch, or revoking any signatures without his written co-authorization. A cold, heavy weight dropped into the pit of my stomach. This was the unforeseen variable. I had fully anticipated the financial theft. I had left the digital trail of the phantom ledger open precisely to lure Julian into committing a traceable wire fraud. But an ex parte adult guardianship? A legal muzzle that effectively stripped me of my civil rights and paralyzed my ability to formally instruct Arthur Sterling or alert the bank's fraud division without my captor's permission. It was a vicious, flawless piece of legal warfare. Julian didn't possess the intellectual capacity to orchestrate this. This bore the sharp, elegant, and ruthless fingerprints of Chloe Vance and her high-priced family law attorneys. I was completely trapped in a legal vacuum. If I went to the local police, Evelyn's certified notary deposition and the emergency court order would paint me as a senile, combative elderly woman resisting her devoted son's protective care. "You've gone remarkably quiet, Eleanor," Evelyn murmured, leaning in slightly, her eyes searching my face, practically begging for a tear, a scream, or a visible break in my armor. "Where is that famous Caldwell arrogance now? Did it slip away along with your cognitive stability?" I swallowed the burning bile in my throat, forcing my heart rate back down into a steady metronomic beat. Every maternal instinct, every ounce of pride screamed at me to rip that folder from her hands, to expose her treachery to the entire neighborhood, to rage against the sheer, monstrous injustice of being locked out of my own life. But decades in risk mitigation had taught me a fundamental truth. When a predator believes they have you completely cornered, you do not fight back. You play the prey. You let them sink their teeth into the illusion of your total defeat until they grow fat, arrogant, and blind to the trap underneath. I let my shoulders slump precisely 2 inches. I allowed my eyelids to heavy, letting the sharp, investigative spark in my gaze fade into a dull, submissive glaze. I reached out a slightly trembling hand, gently gripping the rough bark of the oak tree for support, playing the part of a broken old woman perfectly. I see, I whispered, my voice intentionally cracking, projecting a fragile, helpless vulnerability that made Evelyn's entire posture instantly relax with a sense of absolute victory. "Julian, my boy really believes I am a burden?" "We all do, dear," Evelyn said, her tone instantly switching into a sickening, honeyed display of maternal warmth. She stepped forward and patted my arm with a condescending, heavy rhythm. "It's nothing to be ashamed of. The aging process is brutal on the brain. Julian is just taking the heavy burden off your shoulders so you can rest. Now be a good girl. There's a black car arriving in 20 minutes to take you to a quiet, fully staffed luxury care suite Chloe booked for you near New Haven. Stay there, stay out of trouble, and let the children have their beautiful wedding in the Hamptons without any chaotic scenes." I kept my eyes anchored to the gravel, nodding weakly, my hands clasped submissively in front of me. I want my son to have everything he needs." "Of course you do," Evelyn chuckled, a low, dismissive sound that conveyed just how truly pathetic she thought I had become. "I'll call Julian and tell him you're cooperating. It'll be a massive relief to him. He was so worried your paranoia would ruin Chloe's photography aesthetic." She turned on her heel and marched down the walkway toward her Mercedes, her task complete, entirely convinced that she had neutralized the great Eleanor Caldwell with a single sheet of paper. I stood perfectly still, remaining in that slumped, defeated posture until the sound of her luxury engine completely faded into the morning traffic. The exact second the street fell silent, my shoulders snapped back into a rigid military straight line. The frail, broken old woman vanished into the autumn air, leaving behind the cold, calculating hunter who had just mapped every single line of her enemy's operational strategy. They thought they had bound my hands with an adult guardianship. They thought they had muted my voice with Evelyn's corrupted notary seal. But they had made a fatal, arrogant assumption. They assumed that a woman who spent 32 years managing international trust compliance kept her private network within the borders of Connecticut. I pulled my phone back out, my fingers moving across the glass with a practiced, lightning-fast efficiency. I didn't dial Arthur Sterling's public office line. Julian's legal muzzle would immediately flag and intercept that communication. Instead, I bypassed the standard operating system, entering a specific alphanumeric string into a hidden browser partition that connected me directly to an off-grid, encrypted server hosted in the Cayman Islands. I initiated a direct VoIP connection. The line didn't ring. It hummed with a heavy, military-grade encryption sequence before a deep, gravelly voice answered on the very first second. "Eleanor," Arthur Sterling said, his voice instantly cutting through the freezing isolation of the Greenwich air like a steady anchor. "I'm looking at the global server logs right now. The Phantom Ledger just triggered a Level 4 liquidity alarm. Someone initiated a $485,000 wire transfer using a digital signature from an altered 2025 Power of Attorney document." "It was Julian Arthur," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotional residue, operating with a clinical, terrifying precision. "And they've just hit me with an emergency ex parte temporary adult guardianship certified by Evelyn." There was a heavy, dangerous silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Arthur shifting in his leather chair in his Manhattan office, the sharp scratch of his fountain pen abruptly ceasing. "An ex parte guardianship? They're trying to institutionalize you to lock down the title verification on the estate before the clearinghouse checks the deed on Monday morning. Who is the receiving entity for the wire transfer?" "Vanguard Crest LLC, I stated, pacing slowly behind the oak tree where the security cameras couldn't track my movement. "They're routing the funds through a high-yield regional account in Dallas before clearing it out into an offshore structure. And they've changed the deadbolts on my home while I was sitting inside my own kitchen." "Arrogant sociopaths," Arthur muttered, a low, rumbling growl in his throat. "They're playing white-collar chess with the woman who designed the defensive grid, and they don't even know how the pieces move. Eleanor, the guardianship order is a brilliant civil maneuver. It completely paralyzes your ability to file a standard lawsuit or issue an injunction in the state of Connecticut. But it does not apply to a federal criminal report that was drafted, signed, and secured within a blind trust partition 5 years ago." "I know," I said, a slow, icy smile spreading across my face, the tension in my chest releasing into pure, unadulterated resolve. "They think they've locked me in a cage. They don't realize the cage is hardwired to a detonator. Arthur, I want a full forensic trace on Vanguard Crest LLC within the next 3 hours. I want to know exactly whose liquid capital funded the cash purchase of my home. I am going to let them put on their designer clothes. I am going to let them stand beneath the thousands of imported white roses in the Hamptons and smile for the media influencers. And then, I am going to tear their fraudulent world apart in front of everyone they know." "Consider it done," Arthur replied, his voice filled with a profound, unyielding respect. "I'll mirror the encrypted transaction signatures to the federal portal immediately. Meet me at the Manhattan Safe Suite by noon. Let the children play, Eleanor. Their playground is about to catch fire." I hung up the phone and slid it back into my pocket. I looked up at the towering facade of my colonial estate, the house I had built with Thomas, the house where I had raised a son who had just traded my physical freedom for a piece of Hamptons real estate. The spring was compressed to its absolute limit. The emotional naine loiseau was perfect. All that was left to do was step back into the dark car, blend into the shadows, and wait for the precise moment tomorrow afternoon to release the mechanism of absolute ruin. 3 hours later, The hum of Manhattan's late morning traffic vibrated through the tinted windows of Arthur Sterling's private safe suite, a stark clinical contrast to the hollow silence of my stripped Greenwich home. I sat perfectly still in a heavy leather armchair, the dark mahogany panels of the room enclosing me like a courtroom chamber. On the sleek glass desk before me lay a matte black laptop, its screen illuminating the dark room with lines of scrolling green data. This was the moment where the forensic accountant inside me completely took over, burying the wounded mother beneath layers of unyielding logic. My fingers moved across the keyboard with calculated efficiency, bypassing user interfaces to look at the raw transactional footprints Julian had left behind. But just as I began to isolate the routing numbers of Vanguard Crest LLC, the encrypted line on my tablet flared red. It was a direct FaceTime call from Chloe Vance's personal account. I slid my thumb across the glass, placing the tablet against a stack of legal briefs so the camera caught only my face, adjusting my expression to mirror the fragile, submissive mask I had worn for Evelyn. The screen refreshed, and the sheer, blinding opulence of a luxury bridal suite in the Hamptons filled the frame. Chloe was sitting on a plush white velvet sofa, wrapped in a silk robe embroidered with Mrs. Caldwell in glittering gold thread. She was holding a tall flute of vintage champagne, her perfectly manicured hand flashing a massive pear-shaped diamond ring that I knew had been purchased with Thomas's life insurance money. Beside her stood Julian, looking sharp in a tailored linen shirt, a smug, unearned grin plastered across his face as he swirled a glass of dark scotch. "Well, look who finally decided to answer," Chloe chimed, her voice a high-pitched, mocking melody that immediately set my teeth on edge. She leaned closer to the camera, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of tears or hysteria. "We were starting to think you'd wandered off into the New Haven woods, Eleanor. You look terrible. Did you forget to take your neurological medication this morning?" "I am perfectly fine, Chloe," I murmured, letting my voice tremble just a fraction, keeping my eyes lowered submissively. "I'm just trying to understand why you had my home emptied, why Julian won't speak to me like a son." Julian stepped into the frame, leaning over Chloe's shoulder, his expression hardening into a look of practiced, cold condescension. "Don't start with the dramatic victim act, Mom. We did what we had to do because you left us no choice. You've been locking yourself in that big house, hoarding Dad's legacy, pretending you're still running the show at the bank. It was getting pathetic. Evelyn told us how disoriented you were during the estate review. You didn't even recognize the temporary power of attorney you signed last year. Julian, that document expired 8 months ago," I said softly, keeping my tone submissive, offering absolutely no resistance to his words. "You altered the year on the notary stamp. Evelyn helped you forge it. See? This is exactly the delusion the court order is protecting you from." Julian snapped, his voice rising in an arrogant scoff as he used the classic gaslighting tactics he had undoubtedly rehearsed in the mirror. "You're completely rewriting history to feed your paranoia. You signed a permanent extension, Mom. Your mind is just deteriorating so fast that you can't accept your own signatures anymore. Chloe and I didn't steal anything. We liquidated a massive liability, that rotting house, and moved your funds into a structured, secure legal vehicle that I manage as your legal guardian. We are doing you a massive favor. We're saving you from drowning in your own senility. You took your father's life insurance payout, Julian," I whispered, letting a single tear slip down my cheek, a performance designed to fuel their absolute sense of superiority. That money was destined for the Thomas Caldwell Scholarship Foundation. It was his final wish to fund the education of orphaned girls. "Dad is dead, Eleanor," Chloe interjected, her voice dripping with absolute venom as her fake smile completely vanished. She set her champagne glass down with a loud, aggressive clink against the marble table. "A bunch of charity case orphans aren't going to bring him back to life. Julian and I have an actual brand to build. We have a status to maintain in the Manhattan elite. Your time has passed, old woman. You were just going to throw $500,000 into a black hole of charity. Consider this an early inheritance. Julian saved you the trouble of mismanaging your estate before you completely lose your faculties." I remained entirely silent on the screen, letting my head drop as if her brutal words had completely crushed my spirit. The contrast was perfect. The young, glamorous, and utterly ruthless couple sitting in their temporary fortress of stolen wealth, mocking the frail, defeated mother who appeared to have absolutely zero power left in her family. "Chloe is right, Mom," Julian added, his tone dripping with an insufferable, patronizing pity. "The New Haven facility is lovely. It's quiet, there are professionals to watch you, and you'll make friends your own age. After the wedding tomorrow, I'll have my assistant send over the long-term enrollment papers. Don't even think about showing your face in the Hamptons this weekend. You look like a homeless person in those clothes, and you are not going to ruin Chloe's high-fashion photography. Stay in New Haven, stay quiet, and accept that you're broke and homeless because you couldn't manage your own life. Good luck." Chloe burst into a short, cruel laugh, wrapping her arm around Julian's neck and kissing his cheek deeply right in front of the camera. "Bye-bye, Eleanor. Enjoy the nursing home food." The screen flashed black as they severed the connection. I sat in the heavy leather chair for 3 seconds, the echo of their laughter still hanging in the silence of the safe suite. Slowly, I raised my head. The trembling in my hands instantly ceased. The frail, broken mother vanished into the shadows, and my face hardened into a mask of absolute, terrifying resolve. They thought they had successfully erased my entire existence without facing a single consequence. They thought they were the smartest people in the room because they had no moral compass. But they had just handed me a digital recording of pure, unadulterated fraud, extortion, and elder abuse. I turned back to the laptop, my fingers flying across the keys to secure the video file on multiple encrypted cloud partitions. "Arthur," I called out into the adjoining office, "the audio trace is pristine. I have their full confession of intent on tape. How is the forensic audit on Vanguard Crest LLC coming along?" There was no answer. A sudden, chilling unease crept up my spine. The law office was entirely too quiet. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my trousers, and pushed open the heavy mahogany door leading into Arthur Sterling's primary workspace. The room was in absolute chaos. Paperwork was scattered across the floor like a winter blizzard. Arthur's desk lamp was shattered on the hardwood, its glass glittering under the harsh morning light. And there, slumped against the side of his leather credenza, was Arthur. His tailored navy suit shirt was torn, and a deep, bloody laceration ran across his temple. His breathing was shallow, his face deathly pale. "Arthur!" I sprinted across the room, dropping to my knees beside my oldest ally, my fingers immediately flying to his neck to check his pulse. It was thumping rapidly, weak but stable. "Eleanor!" he gasped, his eyelids fluttering open with immense difficulty, his hand trembling as he gripped my wrist with a weak, desperate pressure. They knew, Eleanor. They didn't buy the house with standard capital. Vanguard Crest is a front. Who did this to you, Arthur? Who was here? I demanded, my voice cutting through the panic, trying to steady his breathing. "2 men, kêu cảnh sát hoặc đặc vụ ngầm. Chúng thu giữ ở cùng sao lưu chính của tôi," Arthur whispered, coughing weakly as a drop of blood trickled down his chin. "Chúng ép tôi phải xóa báo cáo liên bang. Tôi từ chối. Chúng đập phá hệ thống." Eleanor, hợp đồng mua bán nhà của Julian. Số tiền $600,000 đó. Nó đến từ Blackwood Capital. Đó là một tổ chức tín dụng đến khét tiếng quản lý quỹ đen của các chính trị gia bíp và băng đảng cartel. Gã môi giới Pierce Thorne, gã tình nhân của Chloe. Hắn nợ chúng hàng triệu đô. Hắn lừa Julian bán rẻ căn nhà để hắn lấy tài sản cắn nổ cho Blackwood. Chúng biết tôi đang điều tra. Chúng vừa dàn dựng một vụ tai nạn xe hơi đóng băng toàn bộ tài khoản văn phòng của tôi thông qua một lệnh tòa án giả mạo. My breath caught in my throat. This was a catastrophic, fatal complication. My primary legal ally, a former federal prosecutor with the authority to bypass the adult guardianship muzzle, had just been brutally neutralized in his own office. My primary server backups were gone, and my independent financial resources through Arthur's firm were completely paralyzed by a sudden, corrupt legal strike. I was now legally restricted by an adult guardianship, physically isolated, and my sole defender was bleeding out on the floor while a violent, high-level criminal syndicate stood watch over the assets. For the first time in 30 years, the ground beneath my feet felt entirely unstable. It appeared as though every single avenue of hope had just been vaporized in a single coordinated strike, leaving me completely weaponless against a cabal of sociopaths who wouldn't hesitate to bury me in the dark. I looked down at Arthur, then at the shattered remains of his office, and then I closed my eyes, letting a deep, heavy silence settle over my mind. The spring wasn't broken. The gravity of the situation had exponentially increased, but as I opened my eyes, the cold, brilliant light of the Grandmaster returned to my gaze. They thought they had taken my queen. They didn't realize they had just walked their king directly into an unfixable, mandatory checkmate. The copper tang of blood and the sterile scent of ozone from the shattered desk lamp hung heavy in the air, but as I pressed a clean linen handkerchief against Arthur's temple, my hands did not tremble. I helped my oldest friend onto the leather sofa, his breaths rattling but steadying. The physical strike against his office was meant to be the final nail in my coffin, a brutal display of shadow power designed to break an old woman's spirit. Instead, as I stood up and surveyed the blizzard of ruined files on the floor, a cold, crystalline thrill ran through my veins. "They think they have blinded us, Arthur," I murmured, my voice dropping into a register of quiet, terrifying, absolute certainty. They don't realize they just turned on the lights. The sudden violence against Arthur was a staggering tactical escalation, but to a forensic investigator, it was something else entirely, a confession of sheer, frantic desperation. A clean white-collar heist does not require broken bones or smashed hard drives. You only send enforcers when you realize your legal paper trail is too thin to withstand an audit. By unleashing the thugs of Blackwood Capital to paralyze Arthur's firm, Pierce Thorne and Chloe Vance hadn't insulated themselves. They had exposed their jugular. They had tied their glamorous Hamptons fantasy directly to a violent federal racketeering enterprise. I looked down at the shattered remains of the primary backup server. Julian, Chloe, and Pierce believed that by destroying Arthur's localized cloud drives, they had wiped away the digital footprint of Vanguard Crest, LLC. They possessed the shallow, primitive tech understanding of petty grifters. They truly believed that data only existed where the physical box was plugged into the wall. They had no conception of the unbreachable architecture I had spent 5 years constructing after Thomas passed. I walked back into the inner sanctuary of the safe suite, sat down at the laptop that had remained untouched in the scuffle, and bypassed the shattered local network. I didn't reach out to the authorities, nor did I attempt to file a frantic counter-injunction against the adult guardianship order. To do so would immediately tip them off that the prey was still fighting. Instead, I initiated a deep, subterranean trace on the origin of the $600,000 cash transfer that had bought my Greenwich home. Within minutes, the glowing monitor illuminated the dark room with a sequence of bold, glaring crimson logs. The data pulled back the layers of Vanguard Crest LLC, revealing the transaction's point of origin. It wasn't standard corporate capital. The funds had been wired from a high-frequency trading account controlled by a secondary shell entity, Blackwood Syndicate Alpha Group. I stared at the screen, a slow, icy smile spreading across my face. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a deafening finality. Pierce Thorne, the high-flying luxury realtor, was completely conkiet, drowning in multi-million-dollar gambling debts to Blackwood's offshore bookmakers. To save his own skin from being buried in the New York harbor, Pierce had orchestrated a deadly double-cross. He had used Chloe to manipulate my son Julian into forging my signatures and transferring the Greenwich deed for half its market value. Pierce's master plan wasn't just to split the stolen money with Chloe. He had promised the actual physical deed of my $1 million estate to Blackwood Capital as collateral to clear his debts. But herein lay their fatal, catastrophic ignorance. When Julian used the forged power of attorney to execute the cash sale, he had bypassed the standard title insurance search to secure the immediate liquidity Chloe demanded for her wedding. He believed he was selling a piece of real estate that belonged to his aging mother. He had absolutely no idea that 5 years ago, the true legal title of the Greenwich property had been seamlessly transferred into an irrevocable spendthrift trust registered in Delaware. Legally speaking, Eleanor Caldwell did not own that house. Julian did not own that house. The trust was the sole proprietor, and its assets were strictly governed by corporate compliance laws that required a multi-tier cryptographic authorization from a blind board of trustees to execute a transfer. Julian hadn't sold $1 million piece of Connecticut real estate to a dangerous syndicate. He had sold them an exquisite, beautifully packaged digital illusion. He had taken $600,000 of cartel money and given them a counterfeit deed that wouldn't survive a Monday morning title verification. The strategy formed in my mind with clinical, ruthless perfection. To ensure their complete and total destruction, I had to let them believe they had won the war. I had to feed their insufferable arrogance until they stepped so far out onto the ledge that the fall would be absolute. I had to orchestrate a performance of total, pathetic collapse. I pulled out my phone and dialed Julian's number once more. I let my breathing shallow, allowing the sharp, authoritative edge of my voice to completely dissolve into a weak, raspy tremble. The line clicked open, the background noise of the Hamptons day party instantly washing through the speaker. "What now, Mom?" Julian's voice snapped, dripping with a toxic, impatient disgust. "I told you my assistant is handling your New Haven enrollment. Stop calling this line." "Julian, please," I whispered, letting my voice crack with a manufactured, frail despair that made my chest ache with the sheer performance of it. "Arthur's office. Men came here, Julian. They took everything. My money is gone. I have nowhere to go. I can't even open a bank account. Please tell me you didn't do this to me." On the other side of the line, I heard a sharp, delighted gasp. Chloe's voice drifted over the speaker, clear and sharp. "Is she crying, babe? Put it on speaker. I want to hear this." Julian let out a loud, mocking chuckle, his tone overflowing with the supreme, unchecked confidence of a man who believed he had successfully housebroken a legend. "Listen to yourself, Eleanor. You're completely hysterical. Nobody sent any men to Arthur's office. You're having another paranoid, neurological episode. This is exactly why the court signed the adult guardianship. You're a liability to this family name. You're broke because your delusions made you mismanage your life, and you're homeless because you couldn't maintain the estate. Accept it." "Julian, that house was your father's pride," I whimpered, staring at the glowing red data on my monitor with an expression of cold, unblinking focus while my voice delivered a masterpiece of submission. "The silver casket, your grandmother's jewels. Please, just let me keep those. I'll go to New Haven. I'll stay quiet. I won't cause any scenes at the venue tomorrow. Just give me my memories back." "The silver casket is being appraised in Manhattan as we speak, Eleanor," Chloe chimed in, her voice laced with absolute triumph and cruel amusement. "Those tacky family heirlooms are going to fund our post-wedding content strategy in Paris. You don't need jewels in a nursing home, dear. You look pathetic trying to bargain with assets that don't belong to you anymore. Julian is the head of the Caldwell estate now. You are officially irrelevant." "Chloe is right, Mom," Julian stated, his voice dropping into that nauseatingly patronizing, gaslighting register. "We're doing this for your own good. If you try to contact Arthur again, or if you show up at the resort tomorrow, the private security guards have strict orders to have you committed to a state-run psychiatric ward for a 72-hour hold. Don't embarrass yourself further. Enjoy your retirement in New Haven. Goodbye, Mom." The line cut out. I slowly lowered the device onto the desk. The trembling in my throat vanished instantly. The submissive glaze in my eyes crystallized into a lethal, unwavering glare. They were entirely insulated by their own vanity. They truly believed that a woman who had dismantled international financial syndicates for 3 decades was going to sit quietly in a New Haven suite and eat soft food while they spent her life's blood. I turned back to Arthur, who was now sitting upright on the sofa, a clean bandage secured over his temple. His eyes were tired, but the fierce legal fire that had made him a legendary federal prosecutor was burning bright. "They swallowed the bait whole," I said, my voice smooth, steady, and dangerously quiet. "They think you're neutralized," Arthur muttered, a grim smile touching his lips as he looked at the laptop dashboard. "They have no idea that the $600,000 they took from Blackwood Capital is currently trapped in the trust's automated phantom ledger honeypot. Eleanor, the moment that wire transfer initiated, the bank's internal compliance system flagged the funds under an automatic federal fraud review. The money is frozen in a legal limbo. Julian can't touch it. Pierce can't use it to pay his debts, and Blackwood Capital is going to find out on Monday that their money is gone and the house is a fake. We aren't waiting until Monday, Arthur, I stated, leaning over the keyboard to initiate a secondary protocol, routing the high-definition video of Chloe and Pierce's bedroom conspiracy directly to a secure, private cloud partition accessible by the FBI's Cybercrimes Division in New York. The wedding ceremony begins at exactly 4 p.m. tomorrow afternoon at that ridiculous resort in the Hamptons. They are going to serve vintage champagne, play classical music, and celebrate a union built on the total destruction of my family. I reached into my bag, pulling out the custom-tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit I had secured before the movers arrived, the very armor I wore when the bank's board of directors stood and applauded my career of exposing white-collar monsters. I am going to let them put on their expensive clothes, I whispered, my eyes reflecting the steady, unyielding light of the monitor. I am going to let them stand before their wealthy friends and believe they have won the ultimate victory. And then, I am going to step into that venue and release the mechanism of their absolute permanent ruin. The spring is fully compressed, Arthur. Tomorrow afternoon, we audit the family. The day of reckoning arrived with the cold, unyielding precision of a terminal audit. The trap was sprung before the first champagne cork could pop in the Hamptons. At exactly 3:45 p.m., the powerful engine of a black luxury SUV crunched softly against the pristine white gravel of the resort's VIP parking structure. I sat in the rear seat, staring into the illuminated vanity mirror. The frail, submissive mask I had worn for Evelyn, Julian, and Chloe was completely gone. In its place was the Iron Matriarch, the woman who had commanded boardroom rooms in Manhattan for 30 years. I was draped in my armor, an immaculate charcoal gray Tom Ford suit, its cut sharp enough to slice through the high society illusions of everyone inside the venue. I fastened the platinum cufflinks Thomas had given me for our 20th anniversary. They felt heavy against my wrists, a cold, physical anchor to the man whose legacy I was about to defend. "Give them hell, Eleanor," Arthur said from the front seat. The bandage on his temple was concealed beneath a crisp fedora, his fingers holding a folder containing the certified Delaware Blind Trust charters. "I intend to, Arthur," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "Let's go collect the debt." I stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun. The venue was a sickening, breathtaking display of absolute financial excess. Thousands of imported white roses formed sprawling arches across the manicured lawns overlooking the private Atlantic Bay. A massive white silk tent stood in the distance, crystal chandeliers dangling from the canvas ceilings. 300 of New York's elite sat in rows of white velvet chairs, dressed in tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, completely captivated by the beautiful couple standing on the raised mahogany altar. There was my son, Julian, looking incredibly proud in his tailored tuxedo, holding Chloe's hands. Chloe stood opposite him, a radiant apparition in a custom Vera Wang gown, her fake smile flashing for the social media photographers. In the third row, I spotted Pierce Thorne, leaning back with a smug grin, occasionally checking his phone. They believed they were at the finish line. They believed they had successfully institutionalized me, erased my legal existence, and traded my life for a permanent vacation. The priest brought the microphone to his lips, speaking of sacred bonds, trust, and vows. The sheer, suffocating hypocrisy of the words made my chest tight. I couldn't let him finish the sentence. I stepped firmly onto the pristine white runner of the center aisle. Near the back row, a young sound technician was managing the digital audio mixing board for the entire estate's speaker system. Before he could even look up to ask if I needed a seat, I reached down and forcefully severed the main power input. Pop! A loud, violent static echo boomed across the lawn, followed instantly by absolute dead silence. The live string quartet stopped dead in their tracks. The priest's mouth moved silently into a dead microphone. 300 heads turned simultaneously toward the back of the lawn. A collective, aristocratic gasp rippled through the crowd. I stepped into the exact center of the white runner, my spine a rigid line of absolute authority, and began my march toward the altar. When Julian's eyes found me, his entire physical demeanor collapsed. The proud, arrogant groom completely vanished. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified child staring at a ghost. He dropped Chloe's hands, taking a stumbling step backward, but the shock quickly warped into a frantic, sweating fury. He turned toward the perimeter, gesturing wildly to the burly private security guards. "Get her out of here!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking painfully with panic. "Remove her right now! She's mentally unstable!" Chloe spun around, her heavy dress twisting violently. The perfect influencer smile was replaced by a mask of rabid, ugly hatred. "What are you doing here, you senile old fool?" she screamed, entirely forgetting the presence of her high society guests. "Someone throw this broke, pathetic loser out of my wedding!" The security guards began to rush down the side aisles to intercept me. Pierce Thorne stood up from the third row, his face twisting into a mask of pure dread. I ignored the guards, I ignored my son's screaming, and I kept walking until my foot hit the first wooden stair of the altar platform. I walked straight past Julian and stepped up to the wedding singer, who was frozen in shock. I calmly took the heavy metal microphone from her hand. Her fingers released it instinctively under the weight of my authority. I turned around to face my son, my future daughter-in-law, and their 300 horrified guests. The security guards reached the steps but stopped dead. They were trained to handle drunk wedding crashers, not a woman in a custom Tom Ford suit holding a microphone like a weapon of mass destruction. "Julian," I said. I didn't shout. I didn't raise my voice in anger. I spoke with the clinical, bone-chilling calm that had once made corporate embezzlers break down in tears. The massive venue speakers, rerouted through a backup battery link, carried my words across the quiet bay. "You told me yesterday that I was a burden. You told me to accept reality, go to a nursing home, and eat soft food because my mind was slipping. You said you were taking control of my assets to protect my future." Julian swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously above his tight silk bow tie. Chloe stepped behind him, using him as a physical shield, her eyes darting frantically toward the security guards. "I am not here to make a scene," I continued, my voice echoing off the white canvas of the tents. "I am simply here to deliver my wedding gift and to resolve a small compliance issue." I pulled my smartphone from my breast pocket and plugged a thick black auxiliary cable from the technical mixing table directly into the device. The entire venue fell into a state of suspended animation. I opened my encrypted file manager and selected the high-definition recording from my Greenwich living room camera. I looked directly at Chloe. Her face was completely drained of color. She realized what was happening, but the absolute sheer terror of the moment paralyzed her lips. I pressed play. "To the easiest payday of my entire life," Pierce Thorne's deep, smug voice boomed across the $200,000 estate. The audio was pristine, high fidelity, and completely undeniable. The crowd let out a collective, sharp gasp of horror. Women covered their mouths. Men stood up in their rows. The recording didn't show mercy. It continued to broadcast their treachery to the entire Manhattan elite. "I cannot believe Julian actually bought the whole story," the recorded voice of Chloe Vance laughed, sounding incredibly harsh, cruel, and shrill when amplified through the professional audio system. "He was so terrified of looking broke in front of my friends that he practically begged you to take the house off his hands. He thinks he's a financial genius. He's an absolute moron." Julian turned his head slowly, his eyes wide, staring at Chloe like his entire reality had just been pulverized into dust. "We take the $485,000 US from the insurance policy," the recorded Chloe confessed loudly to the entire world. "We take the $600,000 US from the house flip. Our flight to Paris boards at 2 o'clock in the morning. By the time Julian wakes up on Sunday, he will be completely broke, wifeless, and staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. He can rot in prison for all I care." I pulled the cable from my phone, cutting the audio. The silence that followed was heavier and more suffocating than any noise I had ever experienced. It was the sound of an entire universe collapsing. Julian dropped to his knees right there on the wooden altar planks, his hands clutching his chest as he struggled to draw air into his lungs. He looked up at Chloe, his voice breaking into a pathetic, hollow wail. "Chloe, tell me that's a lie. Tell me you didn't plan to leave me with a federal felony." Chloe couldn't speak. She simply began to weep, not tears of remorse, but the frantic, ugly sobbing of a trapped animal realizing the steel cage had just slammed shut. Down in the third row, Pierce Thorne realized his entire life was violently exposed. He slowly backed out of his velvet chair, trying to slip away into the shadows of the silk tents. "Going somewhere, Pierce?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence like a razor blade. Every head in the audience snapped around to look at the luxury realtor, who was now frozen halfway down the aisle. "You might want to stay exactly where you are," I advised him, "because the exits are no longer a viable option for you. And that brings us to the little incident in Arthur's office yesterday." I turned my gaze back to the shivering group on the stage. "You thought you were incredibly clever, didn't you? You sent enforcers from Blackwood Capital to smash Arthur's office and destroy his local servers. You believed that by wiping out his hard drives, you were destroying the evidence of your fraud. But let me educate you on how real wealth and data are protected." Arthur Sterling stepped forward from the side of the stage, pulling the certified Delaware Trust documents from his folder and holding them up for the crowd to see. "The physical destruction of Arthur's office wasn't a victory, Pierce. It was the bait," I stated, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to my kneeling son. "I knew you were tracing my bank alarms. I left that digital trail open precisely so you would panic and unleash your syndicate enforcers. The moment your thugs crossed the threshold of a practicing attorney's office to suppress a federal fraud investigation, you upgraded your little white-collar heist into an unbailable federal racketeering charge, and every single second of that assault was recorded by an off-grid hidden server that doesn't exist in Connecticut. Me isa siapomasi." Pierce's knees visibly buckled. He reached out, grabbing a guest's chair to keep from collapsing onto the grass. "And let's talk about the Greenwich estate," I said, looking down at Chloe, whose custom Vera Wang dress was now dragging in the dirt of the stage. "The deed you forced Julian to forge and sell to Vanguard Crest LLC for $600,000 cash? It's a worthless piece of counterfeit paper. 5 years ago, I transferred the legal title of that house into an irrevocable spendthrift trust. Legally, I don't own that house, and neither does Julian. You didn't sell $1 million estate to Blackwood Capital. Julian, you committed massive document forgery to sell a complete illusion." "Amikai B. The money," Julian gasped, his face slick with sweat and tears as he looked up at me, his fingers trembling against my Tom Ford trousers. "The $600,000 from the sale?" "Ah, yes. The $600,000 you took from a violent syndicate of loan sharks to clear Pierce's debts," I whispered, the microphone carrying my icy tone to the very back row. "Because that account was a digital honeypot tethered directly to the federal compliance grid. The moment the wire transfer hit, the bank's security system swallowed it whole. The funds are permanently frozen under an automatic federal fraud review. You cannot access a single penny. Pierce cannot pay his debt to Blackwood Capital, and the cartel is currently trying to reach him." At that exact moment, as if scripted by the gods of retribution, a phone began to ring violently from Pierce Thorne's pocket. The screen flashed brightly with an unknown encrypted number. Pierce stared at it, his chest heaving, his face turning an ash-gray color. He dropped the phone into the grass as if it were burning his skin. "Go ahead and answer it, Pierce," I suggested. "Tell the violent loan sharks from Blackwood why their $600,000 is locked in a federal vault. Tell them the house you promised them as collateral doesn't legally exist." Before Pierce could even whimper, the heavy silence of the estate was shattered by a high-pitched, deafening wail. Within seconds, the sound multiplied. 3 massive, unmarked black SUVs crashed through the decorative wooden fencing at the edge of the lawn, tearing deep, ugly trenches into the expensive landscaping, sending mud and crushed white rose petals flying into the air. The vehicles skidded to a violent halt directly in front of the altar. The doors flew open. A dozen federal agents wearing tactical vests with the letters FBI emblazoned in bold yellow across their chests poured out onto the grass, weapons drawn. "Nobody moves!" the lead special agent shouted. "Secure the perimeter!" 2 agents sprinted up the wooden stairs of the platform. Julian didn't even attempt to run. He remained on his knees, weeping hysterically as the cold steel handcuffs were clamped tightly over his expensive silk cuffs. "Eleanor Gallagher Caldwell, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and criminal conspiracy," the agent recited, pulling Julian to his feet. My son looked at me one last time, his eyes begging for mercy, for a mother's warmth. I offered him absolute ice. I stared back at him with the detached gaze of an auditor processing a bad debt. Down in the grass, Pierce Thorne tried to make a frantic run toward the tents. 2 tactical agents tackled him instantly, driving his face hard into the muddy trench left by the SUV tires, pinning his arms behind his back. Chloe Vance watched her entire universe disintegrate in a matter of seconds. Her brand was permanently dead. 300 people were currently filming her humiliation on their smartphones. The money was gone. Her lover was in the mud. She dropped her bridal bouquet and threw herself entirely onto her knees at my feet, the white silk of her designer dress soaking up the dirt from the stage. "Eleanor, please!" Chloe sobbed hysterically, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, grotesque streaks. She reached out, her manicured fingers clutching the bottom of my trousers like a drowning woman. "You have to tell them I didn't know. Pierce forced me to do it. He manipulated me. I love Julian. Please, you can't let them take me to prison. I won't survive in a place like that. Please, Eleanor, have mercy." I looked down at the pathetic creature groveling in the dirt at my feet. I didn't feel a single shred of sympathy. I felt only an overwhelming sense of disgust. I reached down, my fingers cold and deliberate, and firmly pried her hands off my clothes, stepping back to establish a permanent physical distance between us. "You made your choices, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly clear, completely devoid of any emotional residue. "You orchestrated the theft of my husband's legacy. You mocked my supposed illness. You sat in my house, drank my wine, and laughed while planning to leave my son with a federal indictment." I reached into the front pocket of my trousers, my fingers brushing against the crisp paper I had kept exactly for this moment. I pulled out the crisp new $100 bill she had shoved into my chest at the yacht club. I held it between my index and middle fingers, mirroring the exact demeaning gesture she had used against me. I looked into her sobbing, desperate eyes and let the bill slip from my fingers. It fluttered gracefully through the afternoon breeze before landing softly directly in her muddy lap. "You should take a taxi to the detention facility, Chloe," I said, my voice cold, absolute, and final. "Your perfect aesthetic is completely ruined." 6 months have passed since that spectacular, devastating afternoon in the Hamptons, and the crisp, golden autumn air has once again settled over Greenwich, Connecticut. The violent storm that threatened to tear my life apart has fully receded, leaving behind a sky so clear and peaceful it feels as though the universe itself has been thoroughly scrubbed clean. I am sitting on the front porch of my colonial estate, wrapped in a soft cashmere shawl, holding a steaming cup of dark black coffee. The house around me is no longer a hollow, echoing shell. Every single piece of antique furniture, every family painting, and every fragile memory has been meticulously returned to its rightful place. The heavy 19th century silver gilt jewelry casket sits exactly where my grandmother first placed it, its polished surfaces gleaming under the gentle morning sun. The movers may have stripped these rooms out of greed, but they forgot a fundamental truth about architecture. You can carry away the timber and the silver, but you cannot break a foundation laid with 30 years of unwavering love and unyielding integrity. The house is quiet now, but it no longer feels lonely. It feels remarkably, entirely safe. The wheels of the justice system turned with surprising clinical speed once Arthur Sterling and I presented the federal prosecutors with our pristine digital evidence cache. Facing the absolute finality of the high-definition video confessions, the forged notary ledgers, and the clear wire fraud trails, Julian did not even attempt to mount a defense. His high-priced public defender immediately advised him to sign a blind plea agreement to avoid the maximum statutory penalties. My son, the boy who believed he was a financial genius capable of outmaneuvering his aging mother, is currently serving a 5-year sentence in a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania. He writes to me occasionally. The envelopes arrive stamped with the stark blue ink of the federal prison system. I read his letters carefully, scanning his hurried handwriting for any sign of genuine transformation, but I do not reply. The pages are filled with frantic, desperate apologies, but they read more like the superficial regrets of a man who is incredibly sorry he got caught, rather than a son who is truly sorry for what he did. He constantly complains about the cold concrete floor of his cell, the tasteless food, and the absolute loss of his luxurious lifestyle. Perhaps over the next 5 long years, cut off from the artificial safety nets of his inheritance, Julian will finally learn the absolute hard-earned value of an honest dollar. Chloe Vance did not fare any better. Her high society brand was completely and permanently obliterated the exact moment the tactical agents clamped the steel handcuffs over her wrists in front of 300 elite wedding guests. She tried desperately to spin a false media narrative of victimhood, crying on local news broadcasts that she was entirely brainwashed and manipulated by the terrible men in her life. The federal prosecutors, however, did not buy a single second of her tearful performance. She was formally indicted as a primary co-conspirator in federal wire fraud and elder exploitation. The wealthy, shallow friends she had spent years trying to impress on social media abandoned her overnight. Nobody in Manhattan wanted their personal brand associated with a high-profile criminal syndicate. Today, she lives in a tiny, cramped studio apartment in Queens, working a grueling minimum-wage retail job just to pay off her constantly mounting legal fees. Every single day of her life is now a bitter, exhausting reminder of the incredible wealth and freedom she threw away out of sheer, endless greed. As for Pierce Thorne, his fate was decided entirely outside the traditional structure of a federal courtroom. When the United States government permanently frozen and seized the fraudulent Vanguard Crest LLC holding accounts, the $600,000 cash principal he had borrowed from Blackwood Capital was confiscated as illegal proceeds of a major financial crime. The violent loan sharks running the syndicate did not care about federal freezes, blind trusts, or bureaucratic banking protocols. They only cared about the undeniable reality that their massive short-term investment was completely gone. Pierce practically vanished into thin air exactly 3 days after his disastrous double cross was exposed at the altar. Rumor has it, he fled the state entirely under a false identity, leaving behind his leased luxury cars and his failing real estate business. He will spend the entire rest of his miserable life looking constantly over his shoulder, jumping at every single shadow, knowing that the syndicate will never, ever stop hunting him down. He traded a comfortable, secure professional career for a quick, fraudulent payout, successfully purchasing himself a permanent, waking nightmare. A sleek black car pulls smoothly into my gravel driveway, interrupting my morning reflections. Arthur Sterling steps out of the front seat, carrying a thick leather briefcase. He walks up the stone porch steps, his face glowing with a warm, genuine smile, and hands me a pristine stack of finalized legal documents. "Good morning, Eleanor," Arthur says softly, his voice filled with deep admiration. "Today is the day, my friend." I set my warm coffee down and take the heavy silver fountain pen he offers me. The crisp white papers before me represent the absolute culmination of my sacred promise to Thomas. The federal courts not only fully restored the stolen $485,000 to my primary accounts, but they also released a substantial portion of the seized syndicate funds as direct restitution for the severe emotional and structural damages inflicted upon my estate. With a few precise, deliberate strokes of the pen, I sign the final establishing charters. The funds are officially transferred. The defunct community center on the lower side of Manhattan has been completely purchased, secured, and fully renovated to the highest standards. Next week, Arthur and I will cut the red ribbon and officially open the doors to the Thomas Caldwell Sanctuary for Girls. It will serve as an unassailable haven for innocent children who have nowhere else to go. Children who desperately deserve a clean, honest chance to build a real future. It is a legacy of absolute kindness, beautifully constructed from the terrible, frozen ashes of profound human greed. I hand the papers back to Arthur, watching him drive away into the autumn sun, leaving me completely alone with the quiet triumph of absolute justice. Blood makes you related, but loyalty and respect make you family, and if you cannot bring honesty to my table, you will not be permitted to sit at it. At 68, my life isn't over. It has simply been properly, thoroughly audited. But this story makes me wonder about the world we live in today. Have you ever had someone you loved, someone you poured your entire heart, trust, and soul into, turn around and completely betray you for absolute greed? How did you survive the sting of a relative trying to pull the rug out from under your life? Let me know your thoughts and your own personal experiences in the comments section below. I read every single one of them. If you found Eleanor's clinical execution of justice satisfying, please make sure to smash that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and hit subscribe to join our community for more high-stakes audio dramas. Thank you for listening, and stay safe out there.
Sau khi chứng kiến toàn bộ câu chuyện, tôi nhận ra giá trị của sự tôn trọng và lòng trung thành luôn vượt lên trên mối quan hệ huyết thống. Máu mủ suy cho cùng chỉ là yếu tố sinh học, nhưng chính sự tử tế và đạo đức mới định nghĩa được hai tiếng gia đình thực sự. Kẻ mù quáng vì tham vọng và lòng tham vô độ sẽ dẫn tới sai lầm lớn khi coi thường sự im lặng của người mẹ, đánh đồng nó với sự yếu đuối và nhu nhược. Để rồi họ phải cay đắng nhận ra rằng sự im lặng của một chuyên gia tài chính kỳ cựu chính là khoảnh khắc và đang bình thản tính toán cái giá phải trả cho sự sụp đổ của kẻ phản bội. Cuộc sống này không có chỗ cho sự dung túng mù quáng. Một khi tôn nghiêm bị xúc phạm và ranh giới đạo đức bị dẫm đạp, công lý được thực thi bằng lý trí sắt đá và thượng tôn pháp luật chính là câu trả lời đanh thép nhất, tàn nhẫn nhưng xứng đáng nhất dành cho những kẻ phản bội.